Well, we're joined by Reverend Jim Wallis, founder of Sojourners, author of God's Politics, Why the Right Gets It Wrong and the Left Doesn't Get It. Reverend Wallis, who's a pal, also delivered today's Democratic radio response. It's the first time a nonpartisan religious leader was invited to speak about the values that could unite Americans at this critical time. All right, Jim. Come on, a religious leader being picked to make a political address. How did this happen? Why? What's going on here?
Well, John, I was surprised. I really was. Harry Reid called and said, we want to set a new tone. We want to invite a nonpartisan, religious leader. I said, well, I don't think God is a Republican or a Democrat. He says, that's okay. I said, I'm going to say what I think I should say. And I'm grateful for the chance because I think real solutions must transcend partisan politics. I really believe that. And I think we've got to apply our best moral values to the pressing issues that we face. And unless both sides can find a stronger moral leadership, we're not going to get very far, but I think we can. And so I was glad for the chance to address the nation and say it's not about being Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, but what's right and what works. I think that's where most Americans are.
All right, Jim, I read this radio address, and I agree with a big chunk of it. But you just couldn't help yourself, right? You had to start talking about the war in Iraq and the lack of morality behind it, and you had to get into global warming, which is another controversial political subject. Now, you're not the only one that does this. A lot of the preachers now have found it, very comfortable to be speaking out on political issues. Well, give me a response to that.
Well, if you look at the whole thing, I started with how that the scriptures talk about how we treat the poorest and most vulnerable.
Agreed with all that.
As a measure of our society. And we've got to get beyond the blaming each other and find real solutions. So that was
That was okay. And then I liked what you said about getting people out of poverty and caring about the least of us. But why Iraq and global warming, Jim?
Well, I knew the president was going to talk about Iraq because he'd been talking about it all week. And I do think, John, I was trying to say that whether you were for the war or against the war, right now it seems clear that I see people on both sides saying we have to find some way to dramatically change our policy. It isn't working. And how do we get U.S. forces out of there without doing damage to everybody involved? Cutting and run or staying the course isn't going to work. Neither option that we've had is going to work. So how do we find a way, have a national debate,
I agree with that,
beginning next week with the Baker Report? How do we do it?
But that isn't, well, look, I don't want to have a debate on this, but here's what I think. I think if you want to be a preacher, then don't be in political office. And if you want to be in political, if you are, preacher, stay out of politics. And I agree basically with a chunk of your message, but disagree with some of it. But here's the question, Jim.
Yeah.
This culture today seems like you got to paint an enemy, right? It's black and white. You got to go after somebody. We see it in politics dramatically. We see it in all walks of life. How do we take the edge out? Because without the edge, guess what? People flip the channel.
John, you're exactly right. The nation, what we've had for a long time is a politics of blame and a politics of fear. What the country is hungry for is a politics of solutions and a politics of hope.
But
I'm not
Jim,
an elected official.
Hold on, Jim. Here's the question. I think that's what people say. But they get motivated by the negative campaigning. I was in South Carolina with a guy, made a speech similar to what you said today, and he said to me, John, you may be right about this, because when I look at political parties, it's like I look at my football teams on Sunday. I'm for the red team, they're for the blue team. I mean, how do we end the people's fascination with the edge, with the division in this country?
Well, both sides do this. They want to make us afraid of an issue, blame the other side, then take a poll. The election is just the last poll. And, to be honest, you guys in the media, I often get these pre-interviews, and they want to see if there's enough conflict between the speakers to make for good television. So how do we get beyond that and talk about, let's find real solutions?
You tell me how we get beyond
I think this is what preachers and what the faith community, and lots of other folks who aren't elected officials have to say. You got to stop talking at each other, start talking at the problems. And I'm going to stick to what the Bible says about the issues. I think the Bible does speak about poverty and does talk about, the environment, God's creation, as an important issue. And the Bible does talk about war and peace.
But why
so
not,
let's talk about those issues as issues of faith and moral issues, and not as ideological and just political.
I agree with that, but I think preachers ought to pose the question and let the brethren out there draw their own conclusions on it. But Jim, our problem in politics, in my opinion, is two things: one, ego, and secondly, a lack of leadership on all sides. You know, it's ego where you don't listen to somebody else. It's ego when you want to beat them down. Isn't this the age-old problem that keeps us from solving so many problems that we see in the world? And I don't know how we get that fixed, Jim.
Well, you know, the two big hungers in the world today, I think, are the hunger for spirituality and the hunger for social justice. And the connection between the two is the one the world is waiting for. And the ego has to be set aside. We've got to say, how do we be humble enough to listen to each other?
Yep.
Liberals and conservatives both have some good ideas. And you know what? The solution will probably be more than either of us have thought of so far. So let's apply our best thinking and our best dialogue, but finally in the end, it'll take, just as you're suggesting, it'll take our transformation, if you will, our renewal.
That's exactly right.
And I think it's going to be a moral renewal that helps change politics, and not just better ideas.
And not just politics, Jim, but across the board. In the pop culture and business, across the board, we got to stop with the edge. And you know what? You're one good man. I love to have you on. Jim Wallis,
the last thing I said tonight was it's new moral leadership from both parties and from each and every one of us.
You got it. You got it, Jim Wallis. Thank you for being with us, and a happy holiday.